I think often when people think about Catholic ethics, they often put it in the basket of bioethics and particularly sexual ethics, our one-on-one relationships. And while for Catholic health and aged care, those issues of bioethics are incredibly important, the beginning and the end of life, and our relationships that sustain us throughout our life, it's actually the ethics that happens within our organisations that is critical to the way that we live and work and have our being, because we spend so many hours of each day for so many years at work. And so it's organisational ethics that I think is the next brave frontier for Catholic thinkers. And I think for Catholic thinkers thinking about organisational ethics, the idea that we need to come to grips with is that our contemporary health and aged care contexts are very complex. They're incredibly complex organisations where systems within systems are constantly confronting one another and intersecting with one another. But there are the systems within the system of a hospital or an aged care facility, but then there's also the systems with which health and aged care have to intersect, the broader political environment, the broader business environment in which our organisations exist. And so it's thinking about organisational ethics both internally to the organisation and externally. How does this organisation function on behalf of the Catholic community in the way that it relates to government, in the way that it relates to small and large businesses, and in the way that it relates to the broader community, and in particular, of course, from our tradition, the way that it relates to the most vulnerable within that community. So we have, in a sense there, we have the idea of Catholic ethics being about people. We also have it in the sense of profit, the way that we intersect with business. But I think now we also have a sense that Catholic ethics in its organisational capacity, in its organisational integrity, also has to be about the way that it relates to the planet. So we have organisational ethics from a Catholic point of view, which is about people, profit and planet. So if Catholic organisational ethics is about people and profit and planet, how is it that we need to bring our thinking to bear about the kinds of issues and problems that we'll encounter in any one of those dimensions? And I'd like to think about this in terms of, again, three spheres. That a leader who is committed to ethical excellence is going to be the kind of leader who can think systemically. They'll be able to think about each of the systems within their organisation and understand how those systems function for greater mission effectiveness. Greater mission effectiveness will often mean, but not always, it will often mean greater business effectiveness as well. So thinking systemically and developing that capacity within the leader is an extremely important part of the way that we need to position ourselves for the future. But if we can keep that idea of systemic thinking as one of the leader's capabilities, then I think the next capability is around the development of what I call the ethical imagination. The ethical imagination looks at all of the aspects of the system. It looks at the whole, it looks at the sum of the parts, it looks at each of the parts, and it says, how do we make this system function more effectively for the people who are the most vulnerable within the system? How do we make this function in a way that the system itself will not only live and work and operate more effectively, but how will it operate with more integrity? How do we make sure that the people who are at the, if we use the colloquialism, at the bottom of the food chain, how do we make it more inclusive for them so that they can flourish? So, back to our organisational ethics framework. If we have a leader who can think systemically and who is prepared to and enabled to grow their ethical imagination so that they're able to ask imaginative ethical questions about how we make the system work more effectively for the greater good of the mission. The third element of this is the development of reflective praxis, the development of a mindful approach to ethics, the development of a mindful approach to decision making, which enables, I think, the resilience that's called for in leaders when there are particularly messy ethical issues to deal with. And so those three spheres, those three dimensions, thinking systemically, developing an ethical imagination, and being able to sit mindfully and reflectively, and to develop a practice which has the heart as well as the head and the spirit engaged in reaching ethical decisions. But it's not only ethical decisions that I think that the leader makes, because in those sorts of moments we can use the mission discernment framework. A board, an executive can sit around and they can take a series of papers and look at them through the mission discernment framework, and that's a very, very useful tool. But the leader who is interested in ethics is much more interested in developing a culture of ethical excellence, of developing an organisational culture where integrity is at the heart of everything that they do. Now that's easier said than done, of course. How do we create a culture where mission is at the heart of everything we do? How do we create an organisational culture where ethics, where our behaviour towards one another, where the language that we use, where the symbols that we use, where the way that we open doors for one another or not, that the way that we transport a patient or a resident through the facility is done with dignity. They're all ethical questions because they're all about the way that we relate to the other. So for leaders who want to enable ethical excellence throughout all the levels, throughout all the systems of the organisation, one of the things that they're going to be looking for is how they can turn accountability into deep responsibility. Now that can be very difficult in hierarchical organisations where there has been a great deal of emphasis in the past on authority and on following orders. And so we have a sense in our health and aged care facilities of people being more and more and more accountable. And yet a culture of accountability almost looks like a John Cleese film clip of a man going around with a checklist and ticking things off. Are you being nice to one another today? Are you including one another today? You know, have your hand hygiene standards been met today? These days are over. Accountability needs to give way to a deeper sense of responsibility if we are to enable each person within our organisation to flourish. And that's what we deeply want. That's what we want to enable if the organisation itself is going to be achieving anything like ethical excellence. So we can take a couple of examples. Organisational management experts, people like Dave Snowden or Ralph Stacey or William Tate, will talk to us about the fact that in most organisations, problems can be categorised. Dave Snowden will in fact talk about simple problems, complicated problems, complex problems, and then he has a fourth category of chaotic problems. We'll probably leave the chaotic problems aside for now and focus just on complicated and complex. There will be many situations that leaders are facing every day in our health and aged care facilities where the problems are quite complicated. It's difficult to see where the problem began, what the middle is, and where the end could possibly be. The relationship between cause and effect isn't easy to see. And yet we're dealing with these problems all the time. Some cases in point might be the way that some of our organisations, in order to incentivise particular people further up the organisation, are given bonuses. And those bonuses are happening at the same time that they're driving efficiencies, which possibly mean that people lower down the organisation are either having their salaries and wages frozen and perhaps even some people being made redundant. So you have a situation of grave disparity within our Catholic organisations, of some people either losing their job or feeling very job insecure, while others are receiving a bonus because of the efficiencies, so-called efficiencies, that they are able to bring about. Again, we see the conflict between people and profit. We have other examples where we have visiting medical officers or clinicians who are not only providing a direct medical intervention, but they perhaps also belong to a small business where they are responsible, that business is responsible for manufacturing goods, which the hospital ends up having to buy and procure from the same organisation that the clinician is responsible for. In business ethics, we call this a case of dirty hands. There have been handshakes going on and the boundaries between roles isn't clear. And these are good examples of where life is very complicated. If you could peel it back to its beginning, to its pure beginning, we might set things up differently. But we all inherit a system that seems to produce more and more ethical dilemmas, more and more problems. These management tools are important. They are very useful for helping us to think through what we need to do from a strategic point of view to create greater efficiencies, to get processes to work towards the good. But often they're missing ethics. And I think from our point of view, from the Catholic intellectual tradition's point of view, the thing that we can bring to those conversations is a very clear understanding of how people are at the heart of our endeavour. People like Snowden and Stacey and Tate will also talk about problems which are highly complex. We don't know where the beginning is. We don't know where the middle is, and we don't know where the end is. What's the purpose of this particular discussion? It's very hard to find out. We don't know why it is that there are such power plays between cultures. We don't know why there's such power plays between the genders. We don't know why there's such power plays between that old-fashioned word, classes of people. And yet they exist, and we're in the middle of them. And the social determinants of health evidence shows us very clearly that, again, I'll use the colloquialism, the lower down the food chain you are, the worse your health outcomes will be. Our hospitals are engaged in that research, and yet what are they doing about the people who are at the heart of the organisation, lower down the organisation? Are these the people who are eventually going to need our health services because they're going to be patients? So we have an opportunity to enable an environment where people can flourish in all sorts of ways. And yet there's something kind of holding us back from looking at that evidence. I want to know where our moral intuition is about what needs to happen so that the system can work for those people in a way which helps them to flourish. I want to introduce a technical ethical term, and the term is messy. There are so many messy situations in our health and aged care facilities that we inherit as leaders, where again, if we'd been able to roll back the clock and set it on the right path from the very beginning, perhaps it would all be shiny and perfect by now. But unfortunately, that's not the way any organisation works, let alone the complex organisations in which we find ourselves these days. There are situations where there are many conflicts of interest, and while we often ask that question at the board level and the executive level at the beginning of a meeting, are there any conflicts of interest? And always people say no. But how often do we ask that question further and further and further down? Are we able to develop a culture within our organisations where that would be top of mind for people, where there would be a sense of the greater responsibility that individuals have to the organisation, and indeed that the organisation has back to the individual. And this is where I think accountability needs to give way to deep responsibility. How do we enable that though? What is it that we need to do? We're very good, I think, in Catholic Health and Aged Care at sending individuals away to do great courses in ethics. And we can send people to a range of organisations within Australia and indeed overseas. And it's marvellous that decoding the code has become so popular. These are important things, yet they're often about, again, bioethics. It's the organisational ethics, it's the business ethics decisions that we're making every day. It's a culture in which we want to be able to say, again, that everyone here is welcome. Everyone in this place matters, in the words of Mary Robinson, the previous President of Ireland. Everybody matters. And if that's the culture to which we're striving, how is it that we're going to achieve it? I'm not sure that it's always enabled just by sending individuals to do ethics courses, but it is a constant engagement with ethics education. For people at the board level, for people at the executive level, for people at middle management, how are we strengthening their intuition? How are we strengthening their moral curiosity? How are we helping them to move from certainty to curiosity, from accountability to responsibility? How are we helping them move from evidence to intuition and then back to evidence again? This is ethics education. And yet there are so many organisations where this is not part of the way that the organisation thinks. How many of our Catholic health and aged care organisations have a library to which people can go and look at webcasts or read books on business ethics? How often are we encouraging people to have conversations about what feels right in this situation? How would you give voice to your values so that individual staff members and whole teams are encouraged to an ever greater alignment between their personal values and their organisational values? But if we never have a conversation in which people are encouraged and enabled to give voice to their values, I'm not sure exactly how it can happen. So leaders in Catholic health and aged care can shine light in their organisations, but they also have the capacity to create shadows, ethical shadows. And some of those shadows might be in the area of privilege, of power, of misinformation. And what do we mean by that? Our job as leaders is constantly to communicate, to communicate, to communicate, to communicate. Oftentimes we have to hold information back though, and sometimes this can lead to instability and insecurity in the culture of the organisation. We understand that that is sometimes necessary, that we need to hold information back, but there are other times when people are involved in misinformation and not communicating enough. And how is it that that casts a shadow over people, over teams and over the whole organisation? Or the shadow of privilege. The people often in our organisations who receive the highest salaries are also the ones who get the greatest perks. They get the free car parks and the free lunches, where the people who are at the lower ends of the organisation often have to drive the furthest. Mostly they come from languages where English is not their first language, and sometimes it's not even their second language. They come from long distances, they work long hours. What is it that we're trying to do as an organisation to enable them to flourish? Is it that we could be offering English language classes, or is it something that we can be doing for those people that creates a work-life balance that is genuine for them? How is it that we're helping those people? Because that's also about contributing to the common good. we have this beautiful preferential option for the poor. And it's almost like, well, we've devoted our 2% to the preferential option for the poor, and that's it. But it's in the way that people are treated within the organisation. It's the clarity with which people are able to move and progress. It's the clear way that people who are ethnically diverse and culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, how are those people genuinely included at various levels of the decision-making tree, so that we're moving beyond an Anglo-Celtic leadership team. I think in organisational ethics there are at least three broad domains that require us to think through very carefully how we're going to live and work and have our being. And those three broad domains are people, profit and planet. For Catholic health and aged care now, and it has been for many years, but in particular after the Pope's recent encyclical Laudato Si', we're encouraged to think about how our relationship to the planet can be one which is sustainable. And so we want to ask these questions about healing, which we have been asking for centuries, about bodies and minds. Now we want to ask that about how our facilities lend themselves to the healing of the planet. And if that seems like a bridge too far at the moment, then at least how do we lend ourselves in ways to the planet which means that we're no longer exploiting the planet? How are we thinking about our energy consumption? What are we doing about our waste products, particularly our medical waste products? What are we doing about thinking about the fact that our hospitals in particular and our aged care centres are open 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year? The energy consumption that a small hospital has is probably the equivalent of a small town in the outback. What is it that we're doing to think about that? And how is it that we're linking the ideas of people, profit and planet? Is one of those three more important to us than another? We have this beautiful principle in Catholic social teaching of the preferential option for the poor, of a prioritising of the vulnerable. But maybe the vulnerable one now is not only the poor who are at our doorstep, but it might be the vulnerable planet that we inhabit. How is it that our thinking around sustainability can grow and be strengthened so that our decision-making, our ethical culture includes that element of our life? As we try and draw all these thoughts together and to offer a synthesis of where we've come from, what we need to be able to realise is that we've tried to say that a leader who is interested in ethical integrity within the organisation has the capacity and will keep developing the capacity to think systemically, to understand how the parts and the whole work towards the greater good. But that leader will also try and develop his or her ethical imagination. They will be the kind of person who is prepared to ask the penetrating questions about how we can make this system work more effectively for the most vulnerable. Now that's the mission imperative behind all organisational ethics. And the third element, the third dimension, is that the leader will be one who is prepared to develop resilience in the heart of ethical messiness, because they are prepared to reflect, to be mindful, and to develop a praxis which has spirituality at its heart. These are the particular ethical imperatives, I think, for the leader of Catholic health and aged care today. We live in complex times. We live and work amongst some of the most marvellous people on the planet. We have the opportunity to work every day and to look into the faces of people who are highly vulnerable. We have the opportunity to meet some of the world's most interesting business people, to bring those three things to bear, and to bring them to bear in an organisation and to make that organisation work towards the common good, that's a fantastic challenge. It's a wonderful invitation. Who wouldn't want to be a part of it? It's compelling.